All right, Nico, can you say, welcome to another episode of Healthy Births, Happy Babies?
It's a happy episode. Happy babies.
Welcome back to another episode of Healthy Births, Happy Babies. I'm Dr. Jay Warren. I'm the prenatal and pediatric chiropractor here at the Cap Wellness Center. And this podcast is all about helping you have a proactively healthy pregnancy so you can have a safe, gentle, natural birth. And that's going to allow you to bring your baby into the world that much more gently and healthily so you can start off your family experience more powerfully than if it's full of stress and trauma and other health concerns. So if you are a fan of this show and you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. Wherever you listen to your podcast, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an upcoming episode. And also, if you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast and you've enjoyed it and gotten value of it, that will really help me out because that'll allow this podcast to reach more and more parents like yourself that might be missing out on this type of information and helping them along their parenting journey. So thank you in advance for that. And thank you if you already have rated and reviewed. So let's get right to our episode. I have Alex Charfen with us today. He's an ultra successful business person and entrepreneur. I've done a couple of his programs that helps people like myself in business gain clarity on their mission and purpose and how to really streamline business structures around them to actualize that. And he's been extremely helpful for me in this last year. But we're not going to be talking about business today. We're going to be talking about children and learning styles and how it relates to the modern educational system that's set up. And to connect the dots between those two things, Alex, in his own career path, discovered this entrepreneurial personality type. He's going to be talking a lot about that. But those characteristics that allow a person to succeed in business and be more entrepreneurial as a kid when they start showing up tend to be learning styles or characteristics that tend to get kids pegged as ADHD or just not being able to focus or not being interested in school and having learning difficulties. So through all of the work that he's done in business and writing his book on the entrepreneurial personality type, he's also now written or is writing a book called Defending Brilliance, and it's about this as it relates to kids and what things we as parents can look for in our kids if they're having challenges in school, or even if they're not having challenges in school, that they're doing well, but have some other characteristics that don't fit in the mold. He's going to shed a lot of light on this, and it's going to be a really great conversation. I think you'll be really interested in it. So let me introduce Alex and read his bio, and then we'll jump right into our discussion. So Alex Charfen is the co-founder and CEO of Charfen. He has spent his life seeking to understand how to make businesses grow, which evolved into the question, how do you help people grow? Through his research and years as a top consultant to billionaires, Fortune 500, and Global 100 companies, this question led Alex to discover the long misunderstood entrepreneurial personality type, or EPT. He's a highly sought-after speaker on entrepreneurial awareness, and he has spoken around the world to tens of thousands of entrepreneurs to help them identify and live their strengths and grow their empires. And now he's applying this knowledge to children's personality development, learning styles, and how they relate to the modern educational system. All of this is going to be released in his upcoming book, Defending Brilliance, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So with no further ado, let me switch over to my conversation with Alex. All right, Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to connect with you because I've known you from your regular business world, I would say. I've taken your Momentum Planner program. I did the Constructive Company program that you have set up to help me as a business person, and I thank you for that. It's been really helpful. And, you know, you've launched your own podcast now with the Entrepreneurial Personality Type. It's doing fantastically. And we're not really going to be talking about business necessarily. We're really going to be talking about the kiddos. And it's through all of your I guess, life experience yourself and being a dad, as well as everything that you've studied with this entrepreneurial personality type, that's going to allow us to have a really great conversation about our kids. And we'll dive deep into that. But just before we even start into it, I read your bio. People have understood the accomplishments you've had, but put it in a bigger context too around the work you're doing with EPT and now into with kiddos.
Awesome. And thanks, Jay. I think for the purposes of your audience, I think it's important that, we kind of explain why I'd even want to be on a podcast for kids. Because I'm known as, a consultant and coach to really successful entrepreneurs. I help people grow and scale businesses. But I think, that's a side effect of what I went through as a child. And I'll explain that in a more historical context so everybody understands. When I was a kid, I was the really awkward kid. Jay, adults would say like, hey, look, it's Jay and Jennifer and Larry and Alex. and I knew really? That they would do that, but I didn't know why I was so awkward. I just knew I was. And as a kid, I didn't lean into the same systems that most children do or apparently do or supposedly do to get help. I didn't look to teachers or look to the structure around me because I didn't understand it. I was confused most of the time. I didn't understand grades. I didn't really understand the format of a classroom. When time was kind of irrelevant to me. So recess some days came really fast. Some days it was long. Some days, I was just trying not to get beat up. And I was so awkward that I started reading instead of interacting with people. And I started I was 10 years old and I started reading self-help books. So that just shows you how unique I was as a child because nobody told me to do that. I sought them out. And I went through this challenging period where I was reading self-help books, but the more I read, the more they conflicted with each other. Has that ever happened to you, Jay?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You know how you read think of a 10-year-old. I read 10 self-help books, and by the time I got to number 10, it had invalidated half of number 2, and number 5 said number 8 was irrelevant. Number 9 said you shouldn't listen to any of the other ones, and I couldn't take that level of incongruency as a kid. It was hard to reconcile, and it was hard to figure out what was what. And so instead, I started reading about successful people, and once I started, I couldn't stop because I felt so different than everyone around me that I went out looking for success. And the more I read about success, the more I found myself.
So you're reading autobiographies?
Yeah, I read biographies, autobiographies, third-party accounts, historical records where I could get my hands on journals. I did that. What happens, Jay, is you start reading about successful people. And if you read about 10, their life stories are very confusing. They look completely different. It looks like they took separate paths. But if you get to 200, 300, you start seeing similarities and patterns. You get to 500 and 1,000 and 2,000 and 3,000. I just kept going. And when you get to 10,000 and you start really seeing clear patterns of what creates success. And what I found in, going out and looking to find this ambiguous thing called success or purpose was I found myself. Thomas Edison was sent home from school because he was too slow. Albert Einstein failed algebra. You start going back through history. Socrates was so stubborn he actually died for his beliefs. You see that throughout history, the people who changed the world, the people we remembered, were the ones who weren't like everyone else. And today, society has this equation that if you don't look like everyone else, talk like everyone else, walk like everyone else, read, write, and learn at the same speed as everyone around you, and act socially like they do as well, you're a broken person that should be diagnosed and medicated. And history has proven the equation that if you don't walk like everyone else, talk like everyone else, show up like everyone else, and learn at the same speed of those around you and act socially like they do, you are exactly the brilliant person who's going to change the world. And when I share that in mixed company, people say, oh, well, you're talking about the exceptions. I would say I was talking about the survivors. Yeah. Because people like us spend most of their lives being told to sit down, stop moving, stop squirming, not ask so many questions, don't talk so much. And the fact is that that's exactly who we are. That's what we're hardwired to do. We're different than the rest of the world.
And so this is a time, like, you're only 10 years old, you're reading these books. So what was your high school experience like as you got older?
So, Jay, as a kid, the only place where I found a place where I belonged was in business. My father was an entrepreneur. So as a kid, I started working with him when I was 8. My family actually lost a business. They sold it, but it wasn't a good sale. And so I started working with my father at 8 in a swap meet. And I remember it's like a flea market for anybody who's in a different part of the country. I remember the first day that we went, and somebody walked up to our table and bought something. My dad and I were selling like little calculators and watches, and that flea market business turned into a distributorship that my dad runs today. And when I saw that first person buy something, I remember thinking, wow, I think I can do this. And the first time someone bought something from me, I felt like there was this massive confirmation that I wasn't just broken and there was nothing I could do, because up until that point, there wasn't anywhere where I really felt successful. And when I got into school, it just reinforced how different and how awkward I was and how I really didn't belong. And so junior high school, it was always a social struggle for me. And in high school, I was fortunate to run into to get a teacher that taught speech. And so like debate and public speaking. And prior to that, I had a like handicapping stutter. Sometimes you'll hear it when I'm talking. But prior to that, I stuttered constantly. I had a hard time getting words out. Sometimes it would take me 30 or 40 seconds just to answer a question, and especially when there was a lot of people around me or when I was in a class. And then I got into this speech class with a teacher who was completely different than anything I'd ever experienced. And the first day, he had rules, he had a structure, and it made sense, and it was fun, and there was a scoreboard. And he said, hey, in here, everybody's absolutely the same. Out there, you can be whoever you want, but here, you're part of a speech team, and we treat each other equally, and nobody's going to be put down, and nobody's going to feel bad. And when you're walking around, you make sure you take care of each other. And I was like, holy cow, I've never heard anything like this. And that experience changed my life. I learned how to be a public speaker. I ended up breaking every record that my high school had in speaking. I went to the state championship several times. That was where I kind of like learned how to belong in the world. And all the time, I always was obsessively studying successful people and starting businesses. So in high school, I ran a window washing service. In college, I started a financial company and ended up selling it, and then went to do an earn out in Florida. And by a series of chance events, I became a consultant in the Fortune 500. I actually started a consultancy at 21. My first, because I was working with someone who was very experienced, I was able to kind of fast track, and not fast track. I mean, I was able to like skip 10 years of what anybody else would need to do. And my first client was Fuji Media. My second client was SanDisk, the digital flash memory company. And my third client was Fuji Digital. So at 21, I got my first Fortune 500 client. And I tell people at 21 years old, I started holding my breath. And around 35, I learned how to breathe again, because it was like deep end of the pool and intense experiences. And so here I was, the kid who had read all about success and successful people and had obsessively studied business. And at 21 years old, I got into the Fortune 500 consulting, and I was in the C-suite consulting, and everything that made me awkward and broken as a child was now a superpower. My bluntness and telling people what was really going on now had every CEO pull me closer. My ability to ask questions and sometimes make people uncomfortable, but uncover what was really going on made it so that, in an industry where the average contract lasts 18 months, mine lasted sometimes, the first 3 accounts I ever had were there when I sold the company 12 years later. My attention to detail and obsession with details that, used to get overlooked now was something that everyone wanted around. And so it was this massive shift for me. And, I didn't understand what I do today, Jay. I didn't understand the entrepreneurial personality type. I just figured that out a few years ago. But I was obsessing constantly around successful people and continuing to like absorb information. And then here's what happened. I was now in this real life laboratory where I wasn't just reading about wildly successful people anymore. I was in the room with the people who were worth $1 billion. I was consulting with the guy who ran the $150 million company. I helped a friend of mine build a $3 billion organization. When you look at like, you get into that world and you get into it at the level where I was, here's what you find. Every single person is just like me. They're awkward and they're different and they're eccentric and they've been labeled and they've been told they're disordered and they've had all the same things that I had happen when I was a kid. As a kid, I had teachers tell me all of those things. I heard those things about myself. I've been diagnosed with dyslexia, dysmorphia, dysgraphia, ADD, ADHD, Asperger's, autism, bipolar, depression, mania, and all kinds of other stuff. It depended on how I showed up on any given day. And when you look at the difference between me and making those admissions, which I do often publicly now, I didn't up until a few years ago, but I do now because I don't even care. I'm independently wealthy. I can prove my value, and those labels mean nothing to me. But the difference between me and my friends who run multi-billion-dollar companies in the Valley, they can't admit that they have those labels because their stock prices would go down. And the fact is, if they could, we would stop putting so much weight in those labels.
Right. Well, and you obviously navigated all of those challenges really well and are super successful now. What is it like now as a dad? I mean, you have 2 beautiful kids. I see them on Facebook. How old is your oldest now?
I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old.
7 and a 10-year-old. Like, what do you see in them now that, having gone through your own experience, are they similar? Are they different?
Oh, no, they're totally similar. And it's funny, psychiatry and psychology have just started to catch on that, like, ADD and ADHD might be hereditary. Well, yeah, of course it is. And I look at it that we're just completely different than the rest of the world. So I'll share with your listeners, because see, I have this hallucination that anyone who checks into a podcast like this doesn't think like the normal crowd in the world. They're looking for alternative information. They're looking for, new information. They're looking for someone like you, Jay, that doesn't think like every other doctor out there, that in fact has, innovative ideas and looks at the world differently, and they're looking for a new lens. And I think that if you're one of those people, I think you and I have a lot in common, and we are hardwired different than the rest of the world. And I see that in my kids, and I see that in my clients. I see that in my clients' kids, that we're just not like everyone else. Jay, I have this theory that there's 4 types of people in the world, and I'll let you self-qualify what group you fit into. And anyone listening can follow along. So the first group, I call them the caretakers. These are the people who like the act of taking care of other people. And Jay, oftentimes, like someone like you might say, oh, well, that's me. But I can disqualify you for this with one simple question. Do you like changing bedpans?
No.
Right. But you laughed. But here's what's crazy, right? So I study people obsessively, and I've absolutely been in the room with the person, and I've watched them change the bedpan, and I've said, hey, do you mind if I ask you a question? Do you like changing bedpans? And Jay, they have looked at me and congruently and clearly and transparently said, Alex, if that person needed the bedpan changed and I was there to change it and I could be of service, then I feel like that I served my purpose. And yes, I do. I like to be of service. And I'm like, holy cow, I feel like I should have written a check.
Right. Well, when you said that first type, a caretaker, I'm like, oh, that's me. Don't need to go on to the other 3.
Right. That's what a lot of people like you and I think, and it's interesting. I'm gonna let you keep self-qualifying, because here's the thing. Now, Jay, do we need those caretakers today? Absolutely. Holy cow, yes, yes. And did our evolutionary tribe need those caretakers?
Yes,
we absolutely did, because guys like you and I would have forgotten to do stuff like change bedpans or whatever the ancient equivalent was.
Right.
And so let's go to the second group. I call these the communicators. And these are the people who enjoy the act of communication. Now, I bet you just said, well, that's probably me. because you have a podcast, you like to talk to people, you like to educate, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can disqualify you with one simple question. Do you enjoy small talk?
No.
Not at all, right?
No.
Right. When somebody says, hey, Jay, did you see, what do you think about the weather? What do you really think in your head?
Right. Well, I have to say, like, years ago, I used to enjoy small talk because I thought it was connecting me with people. It's like, oh, that's the process of getting to that. But now maybe it's a parent busier, like, or, what you're getting to with those personality types is I just want to get to it already.
Right. It's like, let's get to the outcome.
Yeah.
That's how people like you and I think. We're outcome driven. But communicators, like, they actually enjoy the act of communication. But if you watch, like, you get two communicators together at a party, because I observe this all the time. I mean, they'll talk about the curtains. They'll talk about the drink they're holding. They'll talk about the person's dress. They'll talk about the floor. They'll talk about the game last night, the weather. And it's like, I sit there thinking, and I'm dizzy with the amount of topics that they've talked about without an outcome. Because each one I'm like, oh, where's this going to lead? Oh, nowhere. Where's this going to lead? Nowhere. Where's it? Okay, I can't do this. Right. But did we need communicators evolutionarily? Our human tribe absolutely needed them, because we needed the person who said, don't eat this, it's poison. Don't go over there, there's a cliff. Don't go over there, there's a woolly mammoth. Because again, guys like you and I, once we get to the outcome, we're probably not talking a lot. So the third type of person is, I call them the coordinators. Now, these are the people who really like the act of organization. They like fine print. They enjoy contracts. Like, they're the people who are in the contract. Like, they like contracts for the contract, not the deal, but for the actual contract. And I can disqualify you from this group with one simple question. How many committees have you voluntarily joined in your lifetime?
Too many. Of the other two, I said, oh, I'm a caretaker. Oh, I'm a communicator. As soon as a coordinator, I'm like, no, I do not enjoy the coordinator.
Well, and here's why. Because, like, the coordinator, I have a nickname for them, the memorizers and the organizers. Because it's the people who, like, really love the rules and the bureaucracy and the organization of things. And, like, they want to file for the sake of filing, but not for the sake of, like, having things that we can look at later. It's just because we filed. And if people like us are ever going to have conflict, it's usually with a coordinator. That's why you probably instinctively said, nah. Mm-hmm. And here's why. If you look at those three types of people, wait, let me not skip this. Did our evolutionary tribe need coordinators? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We needed someone who kept track of the seasons and the days of the week and knew where everyone was and understood what was going on and kept things in order. But if you look at the evolutionary tribe, we have the caretakers, the communicators, the coordinators. What is that evolutionary tribe missing?
The, like, drivers.
Right. See, I call us the evolutionary hunters.
Hunters.
Right. Because our evolutionary tribe needed people to go out and kill things. And when you look at how you and I are hardwired, here's what I would propose to you. The evolutionary hunter is that person who has always wanted to go forward, who is driven to change things, who asks too many questions, who inquires about what's going on, who says, what can we do over there? What's over on that mountain? What else can we do? How can we make this better? And we needed a small subset of the population to be hardwired to go out and make things happen, to improve the world, to evolve humanity. And in my estimation, the evolutionary hunter is the only consistent source of positive human evolution, and we always will be. And let me tell you why. There's a very clear reason for that, and it's factual, not opinion. When we look at the caretaker, the communicator, the coordinator, they live for the present. They, in fact, have personalities that are hardwired to cling to the status quo, to strive for average, to keep things the same. So people like you and I who show up and say, hey, how do we make everything better? We, to a lot of them, are just a threat. And so anyone who's listening who's felt like you've been judged for just how you are, I want to confirm your suspicions that you have been, because the rest of the world, while there's definitely the need for all of them, there are factions within each one of those groups that would like to regulate and legislate people like you and I out of existence because they only want things to stay the same. And as an evolutionary hunter, we get up every day. We ask how things can change. We challenge the status quo. We look at how can we improve things. We go out into the future, envision a new reality, and then come back to the present and insist that it becomes real. And that scares a lot of the rest of the world. And I think that, when you look at who we are, I look at my children and I see that exact same thing. My daughters are self-motivated. They go do, they go and create projects. And my older daughter has been writing business plans since she was 4 or 5 years old, and, looks at obsessive. She's just obsessive as I was about reading and learning. And, she carries around almanacs because she wants to have information with her and she wants to know more. And when I look at the human species, we are overall a pretty weak species. If you put a baby human being with a baby just about any other species, including insects, in most cases, the baby human being is going to lose. So when you look at the dynamic that we have in our tribe with the caretakers, the communicators, the coordinators, we needed that entire dynamic along with the evolutionary hunter that gets up every day, pre-programmed to expose themselves, to take on the vulnerability of change, to question what's really going on and make things happen. And that's why, I think so many kids like you and I struggle today, because over the past 40 years, what we've seen is this radical increase in rigidity in schools, the obsession around conformity, or what they actually called standardization, and the removal of movement, the removal of creative arts and any type of self-direction. And what we see as a result is this massive jump in what is called quote unquote behavioral disorders. But if you really look at it, like ADHD has become code for this kid needs medication to sit in this boring class.
Yeah, and there's so many parents that they're being told by their the educators, whether it's a principal or the school teacher, a school nurse, that medication's a route they need to go. And I would say a lot of parents are, they're open to hearing how my kid can be helped, but obviously the people I work with are wanting to find more natural solutions, and maybe not just in a medical sense, but that there's something wrong, but in a general sense of what you're talking about. What environment can we put these kids in so they're not pathologized, they're being supported in the thing. But there are parents that feel like, well, maybe something is wrong with my kid. Like, how do I know? Like, what were the kind of things that you were seeing in your kids that was kind of forking that or forcing them down that kind of road, but you being the parent that you had your experience knew that wasn't the place to go? Like, what were there outbursts, or were there just like lack of success in school? Or
well, when I look, so I've obsessively studied successful people, Jay, and here's what I can tell you about them. They're self-directed. They don't care about anything that other than what they care about. They're obsessive, sometimes compulsive. They have a hyperactivity and a mania to when they are doing things well. They might even have a down period when things aren't going so well. Picasso's blue period is a period in art history, but today he would have been on Paxil or Wellbutrin or something and probably painted daisies. Mm-hmm. And when you go back through history, the examples of that are so vast that when I looked at my children, I didn't see anything wrong with them, because when, as a society today, when we assess human beings, we do so in almost a 100% deficit analysis. We say, what's wrong with this person? What are they missing that the majority of people has based on some weighted average or study somewhere? And the fact is, if you go back through history, brilliant people are asynchronous learners, asynchronous developers. They don't grow at the same speeds as everybody else, and they experience radical challenges throughout their entire development. Einstein didn't speak until he was 4, but he started talking in full sentences. Today, we call that autism or Asperger's. He's Albert Einstein. You tell me if there's anything wrong with that. When I read the DSM or the ICD-10, what I read, especially in the psychoanalytic portion of the ICD, I read groupings of symptoms that create brilliance that have been labeled as a condition that we can now medicate. And it's backed up by a $400 billion industry where psychopharmaceuticals are sold like crazy. And for anyone who's listening, if you end up in the position where so many parents are today, Jay, and this is why so many parents feel like there's something wrong with their kids, because there's an entire industrial complex set up around convincing you of that. What they do in schools now is they don't just have the parent-teacher conference. If your kid's a quote-unquote problem kid, you might end up sitting in front of 7 or 8 people at the school. Sometimes it's as little as 5 or 6, but you'll have a counselor and the principal and the teacher, and it's a panel telling you that you should go do this. And the fact is, when we look at the drugs that we give kids, go look at the studies. The adverse effects are out of control. When you take a tablet of Adderall and you break it down to the molecular level, and Adderall is crystal meth with a hydrogen atom added for a time release, so that it doesn't have the dramatic addictive consequences that crystal meth does in a short period of time. Instead, it has those dramatic consequences spread out over time. So by the time my daughters were, 3 or 4 and starting to hear judgment, I had already solidified my argument that it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm. And because of your experience in school, were you already tracking them to not do the standard school system, or was
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it wasn't really on your radar of let's see how they do in that environment. You'd already seen enough and had your own experience you knew that wasn't for your family.
Well, here's what happened, Jay. We sent my kids to an alternative school here in Austin at the beginning. We actually found smaller schools while they were younger and in preschool. And so we did a Montessori and a student of the mind school for my older daughter, and places where we knew the educators and we understood who was spending time with our kids. Mm-hmm. And then we sent them, when they got into grade school, they went to another alternative school. And then we moved into what is supposedly the best school district in Texas. And we asked around and people told us how great the schools were. And so we decided to try public schools. It was a 2.5-month experiment. My kids were traumatized. My daughter came home the night that we pulled her out of school. She came home. She was 5 years old and broke down, or she was 6 years old, broke down at the kitchen table. No, 5. Sorry, it's 2 years ago. Broke down at the kitchen table, completely fell apart. And I asked her to tell me what was wrong. And when she finally stopped sobbing, she said, "Daddy, I think I'm going to fail at life." This is a 5-year-old, Jay, 5. Mm. And I said, "Kennedy, what makes you think you're going to fail at life?" And she said, "Well, I broke my iPad at school and the teacher made me sit in the hallway." And I said, "What do you mean you're sitting in the hallway?" And she said, "Well, I broke my iPad," and she got really mad because there's not enough iPads. And so now I don't have an iPad to work on. And so during work period, I'm in the hallway. And I said, "Kennedy, when did you break your iPad?" And she said, "I don't remember." Mm. And so my daughter, clearly because the teacher, and again, I don't think all teachers are terrible, but I think that there's teachers out there that really shouldn't be in a classroom. Because if your behavioral correction for somebody knocking something off of a table is to put them in a hallway for a week, let's be honest, Jay, that's solitary confinement. Right. That's what we do to prisoners. That's what we do to criminals. That's the same treatment that my daughter was getting. It only the difference is in prison, it's illegal to have 30 prisoners and 1 guard. Mm-hmm. So we did it and we pulled my kids out, and it's been a while since we did that, and we're still dealing with the fallout. They still talk about it. They both get heart palpitations when a school bus passes. Kennedy, it came out over time. They started really sharing with us what was going on in school. And Jay, what was so frustrating was as they were saying it, I remember feeling the same way as a kid. I remember when my oldest told me, she said, "Dad, I really don't like reading." And I'm like, "Reagan, what do you mean you don't like reading? You come home and you read for hours." And she said, "Well, I don't like reading because in school it means you have to hold the book and go really slow so you don't get ahead of the kids around you, and then always know where they are. And I just can't do it." And Jay, I remember being the exact same way. I would start trying to read along with the class, and I would read past the class, and I would always get in trouble for being off task. And so as a result, I was in the lowest reading group. In second grade, my parents were told I was developmentally disabled. Then we took the California test of basic skills, and they were told I was gifted.
That's a stark contrast.
No doubt. I mean, I went from special education to gifted and talented, back to normal classes, back to special education, and then I just went to normal classes and finally finished. I had to get an exception to graduate from from high school.
So what would you recommend to parents that, like, either their kiddos are just, even starting into school, or if they're listening and their kids are older, like, what are the things you would recommend for them to look for in their kids to start seeking out these type of solutions?
Well, if most kids who have trouble in school, I think, are hardwired like I am. So I'll just share, like, from the perspective of how we work with our girls. Okay. And brilliant children, when they're self-directed and allowed to choose what they're doing and they're excited about an outcome, will do anything to learn. When they don't care about the outcome, it's not like they can pay attention. They just can't. Like when I was a kid, when I was told to do something that I didn't really want to do, I just couldn't do it. I tried. I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to get in trouble. It was just something that was incredibly difficult for me. And when I look at the evolutionary hunter, we're hardwired different than the rest of the world. The rest of the world is in the present. The rest of the world wants confirmation today. The rest of the world wants to know that, like, everything's okay. And the kids who are hardwired like me want nothing more than momentum, just like you, Jay, just like me. Like, we want to be in forward momentum. We want to have that feeling of flow. We want to be, like, doing what we want and achieving and successful. Jay, when you're in momentum, what does it feel like for you?
It's peaceful and it's easy.
It's easy, right?
It's like I might be doing hard work, but I'm in flow, as you said, where it's effortless.
Right. Like the kid whose parents are told that he has ADHD and attentive, which this is a friend of mine. And that same kid sat at home on a weekend and did a Lego project that was over 1,000 pieces for the Millennium Falcon in Star Wars, and sat for 6 hours at a time building it and using the directions. Now, you tell me, is that ADHD and attentive, or is that just a kid who can't pay attention in a system that he doesn't understand in front of a room that he doesn't understand? Right. Because when you look at that same characteristic is in Thomas Edison. Edison got sent home from school for being slow. Then he took 10,000 tries to make a light bulb. So when I look at, in anyone who's evaluating or looking at their kids, start thinking about what it is that makes what's going on a strength. We spent 18 years telling kids, sit down, don't move, stop talking, and don't squirm. And then we spend the rest of their lives hoping that they'll do something. The fact is, if you have one of those children who's restless, you have a brilliant child. They're restless to show their brilliance. They can't sit still. They want to do more. They want to achieve. They want to find something that matters to them, lock in on it, and move forward. So as a parent, cultivating interests and figuring out what they really want to do and understanding what they're thinking about changes everything. And I work with a lot of successful entrepreneurs that have children. And one of the questions that I ask them, because often I'll get on the phone with someone and we're talking about their multi-million-dollar company, but the biggest stressor in their life is problems with their kid. And I just ask a simple question, Jay. When does your child have the opportunity to connect and offload with you? When is the quiet time that little evolutionary hunter who is confused, momentum-based, seeking an outcome, looking to achieve, wanting to make things happen in the world, when do they get their questions answered? When do they get that quiet time with you? And what I coach all of my clients to do is the same thing I do with my daughters. We take them out on a 20-minute to 25-minute walk every morning. It takes 20 or 25 minutes depending on how fast we walk. And they're with my wife and I. And that's when, like, the conversations happen. That's when we find out what's going on. That's when they get their confusion realized. I'll share with you a really quick story of Kennedy, my youngest. Her grandfather passed away a couple years ago, and it was really hard for our family. And it was at the same time that she was in the public school. And we went on a walk one morning, and she said, Daddy, did Grandpa cut his ear off? And I said, what, Kennedy? What do you mean did Grandpa cut his ear off? And she said, well, in class, my teacher was talking about Vincent van Gogh, and he died, but he had to cut his ear off. So did Grandpa have to cut his ear off? And Jay, if you think about like that interaction, I remember standing there and thinking, I'm so glad I do this. And she has the chance to ask this, because as a kid, I remember those types of confusion, like just lasting and being there and not knowing what reality was. And if you think of a child, that has a fraction of the awareness, the understanding, the experience that we do, the story of Vincent van Gogh is like a horror story. And when a teacher explains it in a quick and maybe flippant way, and the child doesn't understand it, they don't have a place to go and get answers. They don't have a place to go and get help. They can try and ask the teacher, but if you're like my daughter was, the teacher had long since stopped answering her questions. So, having that time where your child can connect with you, I think it's crucial. Little evolutionary hunters are full of questions. They're full of energy. They're full of momentum. They want to go forward and they want to make things happen. And when they're allowed to get their questions answered, they do.
And I like that downtime is movement oriented, right? You're going for a walk. It isn't like at the end of the day when kids are tired, sitting at the dinner table, again, needing to, sit still and answer questions about the day. Like it's they're moving and walking and processing. I think that's a great strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I've shared this with hundreds of entrepreneurs. I've shared it on broadcasts in some of my bigger presentations, my classes. It's funny. I go out and I speak on business, and due to the way I speak about business, I get asked a lot of questions about family and kids. It may have something to do with growing up as the child of a La Leche League leader in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. My mom was one of the 2 or 3 leaders in Southern California for the largest breastfeeding support group in the world. So I grew up in a support system. And when I coach entrepreneurs to take their kids on a walk, I get calls back that like the content of the calls would blow you away. I hear things like, so we've been doing the walks for 2 weeks and the teacher's not mad anymore. Or we've been doing the walks for 2 weeks and like the symptoms of Asperger's are almost completely gone. We've been doing the walks for 2 weeks and my kid, who's never talked ever, doesn't say more than 3 sentences at a time, talks the entire time we're walking. Well, I mean, if you just look back at my theory that we're evolutionary hunters, it makes perfect sense to me that once we start moving is when we express ourselves. And when we move in a group, that's when we really express ourselves. We are hardwired evolutionarily to get into a group, move, make things happen, and communicate with each other.
No, that's fantastic. Well, Alex, I know you're working on this book. You're calling it Defending Brilliance, relating to the kiddos. It'll be out next year. But where can people get in touch with you or learn more about this this work that you're doing, whether it's in the context of adults or hopefully soon with the work coming out with the kids?
The best place to get more information on my research is to go to my podcast, The Entrepreneurial Personality Type. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and you can go to momentumpodcast.com to download and subscribe to that. And I'm known as a business consultant, and that's what I do as a living. But the way that this podcast is laid out, it makes much more of an argument for the personality type than just for business. And any parent who's listening that has a child who, people are starting to say things about, or you're getting some negative feedback about, just go to the podcast on the attributes of the entrepreneurial personality type. Because where everyone else sees us as broken, because there's this deficit-based evaluation of people, when you read of successful people throughout history, the same thing that today gets diagnosed as ADHD, which is the innate motivation we have to move forward. Like, Jay, can you turn it off?
Mm-mm.
No, right?
Mm-mm.
But the rest of the population really can. They say things like, I'm going to go lay on a beach for 2 weeks. When I say that, I get uncomfortable. I mean, if somebody said, hey, Alex, you have to do it, I might have, I'd have a breakdown. But like, I'd feel like I was out in the hallway like my daughter. People like us just can't turn it off. And when you look at that innate motivation, that is the motivation, the drive, the personality attribute that has created most of the change in the modern world. People who were driven beyond the people around them were literally the ones who stood up and said, hey, let's make things different. Socrates and his students, Plato and Aristotle, like, look at how they passed that down. Pythagoras said, hey, I think there's something up with the numbers here, and they killed him for it. And you know, when you look at who we are, it's just today, that innate motivation, that's called hyperactivity. You know, Thomas Edison's obsession with making the light bulb, that's OCD. You look at it, there's another side to this coin. And the same things that are making most of society diagnose us today are really the things that make us brilliant and will cause all of your success and your child's success. And so my suggestion is to check out the podcast and look specifically at that episode to begin with, and see what you think, because I take a totally different tact. I think that what is being diagnosed is different, is anyone who's different. And the fact is that different is exactly what changes the world, because if you're average and just like everybody else, you literally just blend in.
Right. Well, I'll make sure to have the link to that, to your podcast and to that specific episode, so people can listen to it. You don't have to write it down while you're listening now. And I also want to I'm going to add a link to, you have an awesome blog post called The 3 Questions Brilliant Children Need to Hear. I think that's really powerful. We didn't even get into that, but I'll make sure that that's there as a resource. So in our closing
other place. Oh, sorry, Jay. Did I just one more place? There's some people that don't listen to podcasts. They'd rather read. So if you go to Free Momentum Book, you can download a copy of my book, The Entrepreneurial Personality Type.
Okay. I'll put that link in there as well. Thank you. So
sure.
I was just going to say, with our last minutes here, like, what's the major take home you'd like our listeners to come away with from what we talked about, or maybe even something we'd even touch on yet?
You know, I think that anybody listening to this podcast is doing it because you're not part of the crowd that just says, hey, I'm going to, go do what everybody else does. And anyone who's like that has felt at some point in time in their lives different, misunderstood, judged, maybe even alone. And I would say like a party of one. Have you felt that way, Jay?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I want you to know that if that's how you feel, those feelings are absolute confirmation that you're part of the most important club in history. Because when you look back through history and you call up the timeline that matters to you, the timeline you remember, and any person in history that matters enough to you to be remembered was just like us. And the fact is, it doesn't matter the diagnosis, the disease, the disorder, whatever it is you have going on, even the situation, the circumstances, someone just like us has been there and has gone on to change the world. So you can too.
And what about for little babies that might be listening? A lot of our listeners are pregnant, bringing these kiddos in, and my baby might be listening through mama in the belly, or maybe parents are listening to this with their kiddos around. What little piece of wisdom would you like to whisper into their little ear?
It's the close of every speech I give and the close of my book. There is nothing wrong with you, and you are not alone.
That is beautiful. Well, Alex, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I know with your launch of things and everything that's going on, you're a very busy person, and I appreciate you coming on to share this work and your message with our listeners.
Oh, Jay, it's a privilege. I sometimes lay in bed at night, and I think of all the kids like me that have been told there's something wrong with them, or have been labeled, or have heard some diagnosis or disease that they supposedly have. Mm-hmm. And it keeps me awake at night, because I know the fact is that if we were to call up any person in history whose name matters to be remembered, we could diagnose and pathologize them to death. In fact, when you read the symptoms of autism online, they actually say Albert Einstein, Amelia Earhart, and a few other famous people were known to have the symptoms of autism. So what are we really saying here? The fact is that brilliance is different. And if you or your child is judged as different, I want you to just make the shortcut and understand that the rest of the world is diagnosing brilliance.
Again, thank you, Alex. I think this is going to be really helpful for our listeners.
Appreciate it, Jay.
Thank you. Hi, it's Dr. J again, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the podcast. It's something I really enjoy doing, and I, as a parent, learn a ton from these experts coming on and sharing their wisdom, so I hope you're getting a lot out of it too. And I want to share something else with you. I've created a guide called the 40 Ways to Connect with Your Baby During Pregnancy. It's full of simple things you can do on a day-to-day basis that will help strengthen that bond that you have with your baby. It's a free download. You can go to my website at drjwarren.com/40ways and just enter your email. I'll send it right to you. You can download it and start working on it right away. All of the research that I'm learning in the fields of epigenetics and attachment parenting is showing that the more bonded you are during your pregnancy with your baby, the better the birth is going to go and the better parenting is going to go, because you have that strong foundation, a strong connection to build upon. So go again to my website. It's drjwarren.com/40ways and get that free guide. And again, thanks for listening.